People of high regard often exist in a world that most of the time requires them to put 1 foot underground, sometimes half their body under the ground. That's a risk they were willing to take, and the risk unfortunately came to some of them in a grotesque fashion. Emperor Commodus, the spoiled, over-the-top son of Marcus Aurelius and Faustina, ran Rome from 180 to 192 AD. While his philosopher dad was busy writing about being humble, Commodus was living it up like the world owed him something. Clearly, none of those deep lessons stuck. This guy loved pretending to be a gladiator in the arena, though not before the fights were rigged in his favor. His other hobby? Renaming Rome after himself. Commodus thought he was Hercules, dressing up in lion skins and fighting half-dead animals while crowds faked applause. When not playing dress-up, he was blowing through Rome's money faster than a kid with a new allowance. The Senate, the army, and pretty much everyone with common sense got sick of him fast. His sister Lucilla even tried to have him knocked off in 182 AD. They failed. She and everyone involved got executed, which only inflated his already massive ego. After that, Commodus went all in on the Hercules shtick, plastering statues of himself as the mythical hero everywhere. By 193 AD, he'd gone off the deep end. He wanted to kill the consuls, then show up as both consul and gladiator on New Year's Day. That was it for his inner circle. Led by Latus, his praetorian prefect, and his mistress Marcia, they decided Commodus had to go. First, they tried poison. Commodus puked it all up. Plan B? Call in Narcissus, his wrestling buddy, and promise him a fat reward. On December 31st, 192 AD, while Commodus was in the bath probably admiring his muscles, Narcissus came in and choked him out. They tried pretending he died naturally, but no one believed it. His body got buried in secret, then later reburied properly by Emperor Pertinax in Hadrian's mausoleum. The Senate celebrated by erasing Commodus from history. They trashed his statues, scrubbed his name off everything, and undid his obnoxious self-branding. Pertinax didn't last long either. He got murdered after 3 months for trying to impose discipline. Then the empire hit a new low. It was basically sold to the highest bidder. Hypatia of Alexandria. In the early 400s AD, Alexandria was a chaotic mix of political drama and religious fights. Christians were flexing their new power after years of being oppressed, while pagans were desperately holding on to their old traditions. Stuck in the middle was Hypatia, the brainy daughter of mathematician Theon. She spent her time teaching rich kids geometry and philosophy, rolling around town in her chariot, wearing a philosopher's cloak, and giving public lectures. Naturally, this annoyed a lot of insecure men in the Christian community. Surely they've heard Cleopatra Thea Philopater before. Surely. No? Well then, in March 415 AD, during Lent, a mob of Christian fanatics, led by some guy named Peter, hunted Hypatia down. They dragged her from her chariot to a church called the Caesareum. Then they stripped her naked to really prove they were standing on the moral high ground and used broken pottery to scrape her skin off. When they'd finished their horrific art project, they tore her body apart, dragged the pieces through the streets, and burned what was left in a place called Cinaron. Nobody faced punishment for this gruesome murder. Cyril kept his job and even got sainted later, because of course. Orestes disappeared from history soon after, probably realizing Alexandria wasn't a great place to stick around. With Hypatia gone, the Christian mob had silenced one of the last big pagan thinkers in Alexandria. Mission accomplished, I guess, if zealotry was the goal. Qasem Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani met his fiery end on January 3, 2020, near Baghdad International Airport, Iraq. The 62-year-old Iranian major general, who ran the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Quds Force, was blown to pieces alongside 9 others, including Iraqi militia leader Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. The U.S. Defense Department confirmed that then-President and then-President again, Donald Trump personally ordered the strike, likely while enjoying the comfort of Mar-a-Lago. The timing was so precise that Soleimani had just landed and barely left the airport in his vehicle before missiles turned his convoy into ashes. The Pentagon said Soleimani was actively plotting attacks on American diplomats and troops in Iraq and across the region. For years, the Iranian commander had been orchestrating proxy militia operations, leaving a bloody trail that killed hundreds of Americans. His Quds Force equipped Iraqi militants with bombs that tore through U.S. armored vehicles like cheap tin, a memory that clearly lingered in the minds of U.S. military leaders. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, promised severe revenge while publicly weeping over Soleimani's photo. But the revenge mostly amounted to launching a few missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq, which gave some American soldiers mild concussions. Back home, Iran declared 3 days of mourning, and millions of people packed the streets, wailing and beating their chests. The funeral in Tehran got so out of hand that 56 people were trampled to death, and over 200 were injured. Pavel Sheremet. Pavel was a journalist known for poking at the hornet's nest of power, got obliterated by a car bomb in Kiev on July 20, 2016. The guy had a knack for digging up dirt on governments across Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, which made him a walking target with a death wish, or at least that's how his enemies probably saw it. Sheremet left his apartment that morning and hopped into his Subaru, parked like any other car on a Kiev street. Except, unlike any other car, this one had a bomb strapped to its undercarriage. The bomb was remote-controlled because pressing buttons from a safe distance is way easier than facing consequences up close. The second he turned the key and started the car, it was game over. He didn't even make it to the hospital. Dead on arrival would have been an upgrade from the state he was left in. Born in Belarus, he built a career as a journalist who wouldn't shut up about corruption, human rights abuses, and state-level incompetence, as he should. Belarus's authoritarian regime hated him so much they stripped him of his citizenship in 2010. Imagine being so good at your job that your whole country officially tells you to get lost. So he moved to Russia, where he kept calling out government garbage, and eventually landed in Ukraine, a place that was supposed to be a little freer. Investigators found traces of RDX, a military-grade explosive, which isn't something you grab off the shelf at your local hardware store. Whoever did this had resources, connections, and a very personal grudge. The motives behind the killing are as tangled as a ball of barbed wire. Sheremet had made enemies in every government he ever reported on. Belarus was probably still salty about him exposing election fraud and police brutality back in the 90s. Russia had plenty of reasons to hate his guts, especially after he called their annexation of Crimea, what it was, illegal. And Ukraine wasn't thrilled about his criticisms either, particularly when he pointed out their corruption scandals like a teacher marking up a failing grade. The list of suspects was basically a who's who of powerful ass. Ukrainian authorities launched an investigation that went nowhere fast. They released grainy CCTV footage showing 2 suspects planting the bomb the night before, but guess what? Those suspects were never identified. It's like they vanished into thin air, Mission Impossible style. People started throwing around conspiracy theories faster than you can say government complicity. Some claimed Russian operatives were behind it. Others pointed fingers at Ukrainian intelligence agencies. Hell, some even thought it was a revenge plot by Belarus. Pick your poison. Years later, justice for Sheremet is still stuck in neutral. In 2019, Ukrainian authorities arrested 3 suspects, 2 veterans and a nurse, saying that they were part of a nationalist plot. Critics called it a scapegoating operation, and honestly, they might not be wrong. Park Chung-hee. On October 26, 1979, South Korean President Park Chung-hee and his entourage were having a private dinner at a safe house in the Blue House compound, the presidential residence. The guests included Park's chief of intelligence, Kim Jong-nam, and Cha Ji-chul, the head of the Presidential Security Service. Tensions between Kim and Cha were already high. Cha had a reputation for being an overbearing loudmouth, while Kim was seething with resentment over being overshadowed in the president's inner circle. The dinner began like how you would expect a presidential dinner to go, with forced laughter and polite conversation, all to cover the lightning strikes all around Kim and Cha. The 2 men exchanged barbs over the course of the meal, with Cha belittling Kim in front of the president. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but Kim, sitting there stewing in his own humiliation, decided it would be the last. As Park and the others ate, Kim quietly excused himself, left the room, and returned with a handgun tucked into his waistband. Then, Kim stood up, drew his weapon, and fired. His first shot hit Cha Ji-chul, the obnoxious bodyguard who, ironically, was supposed to be protecting Park. Cha dropped dead on the spot, which probably brought Kim a flicker of satisfaction. But Kim wasn't done. He turned the gun on Park, pulling the trigger and hitting the president in the chest. Park slumped over, bleeding out in the middle of his own dinner party. If there were awards for worst work event ever, this one would be tough to beat. Park's other bodyguards rushed in, and a brief, bloody shootout ensued. Kim, somehow still alive despite the crossfire, managed to escape the immediate scene, but didn't get very far. He was arrested shortly afterward, as South Korea's military and political elite scrambled to figure out what the hell just happened. After that, Kim made a half-hearted attempt to paint himself as a hero. He claimed he'd assassinated Park to save South Korea from his authoritarian regime, framing the whole thing as a noble act of patriotism. But that narrative fell apart faster than a cheap suit. While it's true that Park's government was a repressive dictatorship, Kim's motives were not that of liberating the country. Sure, he hated Cha Ji-chul, and yes, he probably felt like his influence was waning under Park's rule, But the idea that this was some grand, selfless sacrifice for democracy is like something even Machiavelli would be confused. Did I do this? Well, the end justifies the means. But, wait. Kim was convicted of murder and treason, sentenced to death, and executed by hanging less than a year after the assassination. I say deserved. Oscar Romero. Oscar Romero started out as the kind of guy the elites in El Salvador could live with. Quiet, conservative, and not the type to rock the boat. But when his close friend Father Rutilio Grande was murdered, it became a 180. Grande had been helping poor farmers and speaking out against injustice, which in El Salvador was apparently enough to get you killed. After that, Romero had a moral awakening and flipped the script. He went from playing it safe to openly calling out the government and military for their human rights abuses. Subtlety was not his thing. Every week, Romero stood at the pulpit and tore into the rich and powerful for their corruption and violence. By 1980, El Salvador was on the edge of civil war. Death squads roamed the streets, massacres were common, and fear was everywhere. Romero's sermons and radio broadcasts became one of the few places people could hear the truth about what was happening. This made him public enemy number one for anyone who benefited from the status quo. He even had the nerve to tell soldiers to stop killing innocent people and refuse immoral orders. That went over about as well as you'd expect. On March 23, 1980, during what would be his final sermon, Romero begged soldiers to disobey illegal orders. The next evening, while leading a small mass at a hospital chapel, he was assassinated. A gunman waited outside, aimed through the open chapel doors, and fired a single .22 caliber bullet straight into Romero's heart. He collapsed at the altar as horrified worshippers looked on. The gunman casually drove away, as if he'd just run an errand. Romero was dead within seconds. Officially, his death was ruled a homicide because apparently, getting shot during Mass needed clarification. Unsurprisingly, the country's oligarchs and military denied involvement, though no one believed them. His murder was almost certainly carried out by a death squad connected to the military or far-right groups. These squads had been eliminating anyone who spoke out, and Romero was at the top of their hit list. The investigation into his assassination was laughable. No one was ever charged, and the case was quietly buried. The assassin was likely some low-level goon, but the people giving the orders made sure their tracks were covered. Internationally, Romero's death caused outrage, but in El Salvador, the violence rolled on. Meanwhile, the United States, busy funding and arming the Salvadoran military in the name of fighting communism, wasn't about to let one dead archbishop slow down its Cold War agenda. Henry III of France. The French wars of religion had been tearing the country apart for decades. By the late 1580s, the tension had reached a breaking point, thanks to a toxic mix of political scheming and religious fanaticism. Henry III, crowned king in 1574, inherited this mess, but instead of fixing it, he made it worse by flip-flopping between alliances and alienating everyone in the process. In 1588, the Duke of Guise, the Catholic League's golden boy, was gaining so much power that Henry started to feel like a guest in his own monarchy. To remind everyone who was still wearing the crown, Henry ordered Guise's assassination during a council meeting. The hit went off as planned, Guise got knifed, and his body was burned, but not without consequences. The Catholic League, already pissed off at Henry for being too soft on Protestants, exploded in fury. Killing Guise was basically a Gavrilo Princip move. The League declared Henry a traitor to the Catholic faith and essentially disowned him as king. Riots broke out in Paris, and Henry had to flee the capital to save his ass. The only ally he had left was his Protestant cousin, Henry of Navarre, who wasn't exactly anyone's first pick for a savior. Still, desperate times called for desperate measures, so the two Henrys teamed up against the Catholic League. Meanwhile, Jacques Clément, a Dominican friar with a dangerous mix of religious zeal and homicidal tendencies, was lurking in the background. Clément had swallowed the Catholic League's propaganda whole. He believed Henry III was a heretic, a tyrant, and basically the Antichrist. The League, not known for being subtle, encouraged this kind of thinking. Clément, convinced he was on a mission from God, started plotting how to take Henry out. On August 1, 1589, Clément made his move. Henry was camped near Saint-Cloud with his army, preparing to retake Paris from the Catholic League. Clément, carrying a forged letter and a knife hidden under his robes, showed up at the camp and requested a private audience with the king. Henry's guards let him through, either because they were incompetent or because they underestimated how dangerous a monk could be. Once inside the royal quarters, Clément handed Henry the letter. As the king started to read it, Clément pulled out the knife and stabbed him in the stomach. Guards immediately swarmed Clément and killed him on the spot, probably feeling stupid for letting him in the first place. Henry, clutching his wound, collapsed, but didn't die right away. Before he died, he managed to name Henry of Navarre as his successor. This pissed off the Catholic League even more, since they hated Navarre almost as much as they hated Henry III. When Henry finally died, he took the Valois dynasty with him to the grave. Tsar Paul I of Russia. Paul took over as Tsar of Russia in 1796 after his mom, Catherine the Great, became Catherine the Dead. From the get-go, Paul excelled at alienating pretty much everyone in Russian politics. He came to power bitter and insecure, still salty about how Catherine had sidelined him during her reign. Instead of solving the empire's problems, Paul busied himself undoing her policies, as if rewriting history would somehow make him shine. One of the ideas his brilliant mind made was harsh military reforms. He demanded strict discipline, forced Prussian-style uniforms on everyone, and insisted on endless drills. Practicality and popularity be damned. The already strained Russian military wasn't thrilled. Soldiers griped, officers fumed, and the general vibe was, how much longer do we have to deal with this guy? The nobility didn't get off easy either. Paul meddled with their land ownership, slashed their privileges, and basically made their lives miserable, coming across more like a control freak than a competent ruler. Paul's foreign policy was just as erratic. He abruptly flipped alliances, first ditching Britain and then buddying up with France. He even entertained Napoleon's bizarre idea of invading British India, a fantasy that showcased just how out of touch Paul was. By the early 1800s, resentment against him was hitting boiling point. Finally, in 1801, a group of nobles and military officers snapped. Led by Count Peter von der Pahlen and General Levin August von Bennigsen, they planned to force Paul to abdicate in favor of his son, Alexander. Alexander, conveniently, had no clue about the plot. But, as these things go, the plan didn't exactly stay clean. On the night of March 23, 1801, the conspirators marched into St. Michael's Castle, where Paul had been hiding out, paranoid and surrounded by guards. Not that it mattered, but those guards were either bribed or just didn't care. The conspirators, drunk and determined, stormed into Paul's chambers. He tried to hide, barricading himself in his bedroom, but they smashed through with ease. They found him cowering behind a screen or a fireplace. Different versions. Paul was dragged out, beaten senseless, and strangled with a scarf. For good measure, the conspirators all stomped on him. His body stayed there for hours before anyone bothered to deal with it. Officially, his death was ruled apoplexy, a lie that fooled exactly no one. The conspirators wasted no time installing his son, Alexander I, as the new Tsar. Though Alexander wasn't exactly thrilled about his dad being murdered, he accepted the crown, he promised reforms, and everyone pretended the assassination had been for the greater good. An impressive feat, considering the blood still drying on the carpet. Kim Jong-nam. Kim Jong-nam, eldest son of North Korea's former leader Kim Jong-il, spent years in exile after falling out of favor. His downfall started in 2001 when he embarrassed the regime by trying to sneak into Japan with a fake passport to visit Tokyo Disneyland. Yep, of all the things to risk your family's wrath over, he chose Mickey Mouse. This humiliated the North Korean leadership, and Jong-nam was essentially kicked out of the line of succession. By the time his half-brother Kim Jong-un took over in 2011, Jong-nam was living in Macau, far from Pyongyang, occasionally making critical comments about the North Korean government. This made him a problem for Kim Jong-un, who didn't take kindly to anyone, especially family, posing even the faintest threat to his power. Jong-nam wasn't actively plotting anything. In fact, he seemed uninterested in politics, but his existence as a potential figurehead for rebels was enough to put a giant target on his back. By 2017, that target became fatal. On February 13, 2017, Jong-nam arrived at Kuala Lumpur International Airport in Malaysia, planning to fly to Macau. He was traveling alone, without bodyguards, which raises questions about whether he was overconfident or just naive. While walking through the terminal, two women approached him, Siti Aisyah, an Indonesian, and Joan Thi Huang, a Vietnamese national. Each carried a cloth soaked in VX nerve agent, one of the deadliest chemical weapons out there. The attack was staged to look like a prank. The women smeared the chemical on his face and casually walked away. At first, Jong-nam stood there confused and was like, "This isn't the kind of airport service I signed up for." But VX works fast. Within minutes, his vision blurred, his muscles seized, and he stumbled to an information desk, gasping for help. He told staff someone had sprayed him with a liquid. Medical staff rushed him to a clinic, but it was already too late. The nerve agent had shut down his nervous system, and he was dead within 20 minutes. Malaysian authorities arrested the two women within days. They claimed they thought they were filming a TV prank show, and absurd as it sounded, they may have been telling the truth. Evidence suggests North Korean operatives duped them into the attack, having them practice pranks with harmless liquids weeks before the assassination. Meanwhile, the North Korean agents behind the operation fled Malaysia, leaving a trail of evidence. Security footage, travel records, and testimonies all pointed to Pyongyang's involvement, though North Korea denied everything, of course. Their official story was that Jong-nam had a heart attack, an excuse that would be laughable if it weren't so brutal. The Malaysian government wasn't buying it and publicly accused North Korea of orchestrating the assassination. Jong-nam's body became a diplomatic battleground. North Korea demanded it back immediately, but Malaysia refused until an autopsy was conducted. The results confirmed VX nerve agent as the cause of death, sealing the regime's guilt. After weeks of tense negotiations, Malaysia handed over the body, which was quietly flown to Pyongyang. What happened to it after that is anyone's guess, but one thing is for sure: he was another one of Kim Jong-un's means to an end. Alexander Litvinenko. He was a former FSB agent, a KGB member with a fresh coat of paint. He sat down for a cup of tea at the Millennium Hotel in London with two Russian agents on November 1, 2006. He met with Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, who slipped polonium-210 into his drink while he wasn't looking. The radioactive poison started its work immediately, though he wouldn't know it for days. The symptoms hit him like a train: hair loss, vomiting, and internal bleeding. His organs shut down one by one while doctors scratched their heads trying to figure out what the hell was wrong with him. By the time they identified polonium-210 poisoning, his ass was already cooked. The guy spent 3 weeks in absolute agony at University College Hospital. His body basically ate itself from the inside out. Radiation does that to you when some state-sponsored Agent 47 spike your Earl Grey. He turned yellow, lost all his hair, and couldn't eat anything. This was him. Then this was him after the poisoning. Litvinenko knew he was marked, though. He'd been spilling Russia's dirty secrets since he fled to the UK in 2000. He accused the FSB of bombing apartment buildings to start a war in Chechnya, exposed their organized crime connections, and called Putin a pedophile. MI6 even had him on their payroll as a consultant, while every FSB agent in Moscow was probably putting his picture on their dartboard. The investigation traced polonium-210 all over London like some radioactive breadcrumb trail. These genius assassins left traces in their hotel rooms, restaurants, and even on the planes they flew in on. The stuff showed up in the teapot at the Millennium Hotel, which might as well have had "murder weapon" written on it in neon lights. British investigators wanted to charge Lugovoy and Kovtun with murder, but Russia told them to piss off. These two clowns are living it up in Moscow. Lugovoy even became a member of parliament, getting immunity from prosecution. Russia's official response was basically prove it, while doing that thing Sukuna did. Honorable mentions: John Lennon, John F. Kennedy, Abraham Lincoln, and Martin Luther King Jr. Now I've been thinking, there's a lot more where these came from. So just tell me if you want another one of these. See y'all.